When I first read about this year's GTMK Game Jam, I wasn't sure if I was ready to join. I've been watching game makers' toolkit videos for years, but I've never thought of participating in one of the jams. This year was a bit different though. I had just started learning how to make my own games, but I wasn't sure if I would be ready to face the craziness of making a game in 48 hours. I ended up signing up 6 weeks before the start of the jam. This meant 6 weeks to try and learn as much as possible to get ready. It was about this time that I discovered Pico 8. I immediately fell for its charm and simplicity, and while I had been learning Game Maker up until that point, I thought that Pico 8 would be a good tool to use for my first jam. And in hindsight, it was definitely the right call. So I spent most of the 6 weeks focusing on learning Pico 8, which is part of the reason why I haven't made another devlog video. Even with all this prep, I wasn't sure if I would be able to make anything in 48 hours, but I was willing to give it a shot. The time for the jam came and the theme was announced on Friday at 8 PM. The theme was Out of Control. I started by doing a mind map to try to start generating some ideas. After some time of doing this, I had a couple of potential ideas, but I was still not happy with any of them, so I thought I would list possible genres for the game. I wanted to stay away from platformers since I didn't want to be dealing with lots of collisions. I thought of a puzzle based around blocks, a text game, and a game with lots of simple minigames like WarioWare. I was trying to come up with an engaging idea within the theme that I thought could be achievable with my current knowledge. I'd say that this was the most challenging part of the experience, being really critical about what I thought I could achieve within 48 hours and cutting anything else out. This meant that I couldn't really run wild with an idea because it would take time for me to figure out how to implement all the mechanics. By the end of the day, I had 2 main possible ideas that I thought I could build on. A puzzle with constant moving pieces, and a story-driven game. I decided to go to bed early and revisit them in the morning. I started Saturday by trying out the puzzle idea. I began by making a block that would be constantly moving in and out of the screen, giving the feeling of being out of control. I added a way for the player to be able to move the block up and down, and added a goal where the player had to take the block too. After messing around with it for a bit, I realized that I wasn't really engaged with this concept, so I decided to give the story-driven game idea a go. For this one, I revisited a previous concept I had thought of. About a year ago, I came up with this idea about a game inspired by Space Invaders and Galaga, but that focused on the psychological aspects of being a space pilot rather than shooting aliens. I decided to go for this concept and introduce the theme of being out of control through the story and in-game events to also convey the feeling of being out of control. At this point, I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted the game to look like. You would be able to see the ship in space and a visual of the pilot next to a text box. The player would go through the pilot's thoughts, trying to piece together what happened and helping him regain control of the ship by executing simple interactions within the cockpit. I started by drawing the text box and adding some text. I quickly realized though that I needed more screen space to fit enough text on screen at once, so I had to move the pilot's picture above the text box. Then I designed the ship's sprite and drew it on the screen. Next, I did a quick Google search to see if I could find how to do pixelated transitions in Pico 8, and I found a card by Dr. Pete. I ended up modifying the code a bit and using it as a backdrop for the stars rather than as a transition, but it worked great. In terms of the visuals, I wanted to create a somewhat tense and unsettling atmosphere, kinda claustrophobic by being in the ship, but still approachable and enjoyable. I thought I would keep the color count low. I went for black and dark blue for space and the text box, and white as a highlight for the text. As I was adding more of the narrative to the game, I felt like the text needed to stand out a bit more, so I added a 4th color to the palette. I chose the yellowy orange in Pico 8 since I felt it would add a retro feel to the ship's console text. I spent the rest of the day working on adding a couple of branching paths to the storyline and the first minigame-like interaction. For the different paths, I was using Boolean statements to switch between messages and button options. I was making progress, but it was taking quite a long time to get these things in place. After spending most of the day coding away, I had only a few seconds of gameplay. At this point, I was getting tired, and I started getting worried that I had made a mistake in choosing a story-driven game instead of something with a core mechanic that would lend itself to being played for a longer period of time. After going for a walk to clear my head and having dinner, the day was coming to an end. I decided to switch gears and work on the sound effects and music for the rest of the day. I wanted the sound effects to complement the interactions and add a retro quality to them. As for the music, I wanted something simple and that would play well on a loop. I tried to make it sound a bit mysterious and unsettling so that it would complement the visuals. I got up around 6 AM on Sunday. I was definitely feeling the pressure. I went back to the music I had written the day before, and I felt like it would get old if you had to listen to it constantly while playing the game. So I decided to write another track. For this one, I just wanted to go for something more minimalistic, the kind of thing you don't notice it's there until it's gone. I tried to recreate sort of like a hum that you would maybe hear from being in a spaceship. After this, I got to work on the storyline. I sketched out the text and the branches leading to different sections that would reveal more of what happened. I wanted to be subtle so that players would need to piece things together for themselves, but not too cryptic so that no one would catch on. Once I had a good chunk written, I went back to PicoA to implement it. For the passcode puzzle, I started by drawing the numbers on screen and then wrote the logic so the player could input the numbers. Then the game would advance to the next state only if the right code was entered. I wanted this event to be slightly confusing to the player. They had not yet come across the code, so they needed to explore whatever other options were available to them in order to find it. The goal was to cause a moment of slight confusion, but not complete confusion or frustration, so it was important that the code was not too hard to find and identify. At this point, I was running out of time, and it was clear that I would need to make cuts if I wanted to submit the game on time. I wanted to include another interaction playing with the oxygen level in the ship and the fuel left, but I ended up cutting the interaction and simply showing those two parameters slowly decreasing. I thought it would be good if both the oxygen and the fuel decreased at different rates so that it looked more realistic. To do this, I created a variable for the fuel set at a high value and that would go down by 1 every second. To reduce the oxygen at a different rate, I used a modulo operation so that the oxygen variable would decrease by 1 every 10 seconds or so. Even though I couldn't make this a bigger event, I was really happy to be able to include this bit since I think it really added a sense of urgency to an already dire situation. This was it. With only a few hours left, I had 2 tasks to complete and it looked like I was going to make it. First, I had to make an ending scene. For this, I wanted to switch up the gameplay and have the player pilot the ship. I thought I could include the asteroid belt mentioned in the story as the last challenge, but I did not have enough time for that. So to keep with the out of control theme, I thought I would have the player fly the ship with a broken thruster. I programmed the ship to start falling down after a warning message. The player could then press X to use the remaining thruster and 1 arrow key to pilot the ship. I thought the ship should have started moving more slowly than 1 pixel per second, so the player could have enough time to figure out how to pilot it. But I was running out of time and I needed to do one more task, so the ship's initial movement ended up being a bit more abrupt than I would have liked. Finally, I split the game into 2 states, the title screen and the gameplay section. I created an init, an update, and a draw function for both those sections and wrote the code to be able to switch between those 2 states. And just like that, I was finished, with around 40 minutes left to submit it. I was exhausted, but really glad that I had managed to actually finish a game in 48 hours. 6 weeks ago, I wasn't even sure I would be able to make anything in such a short time. I spent the rest of the following week playing other people's games and giving and receiving feedback. I was blown away by the positive comments I received, and the game even ended up in the top 20% for overall score, which I was really surprised and happy about. All in all, it was a crazy experience, and I'm really glad I decided to give it a go, even when I wasn't sure I would be able to do it. Did you take part in the jam too, or are you thinking of joining a game jam for the first time? Let me know in the comments, and consider subscribing if you want to see more devlog videos and game design content. See you next time.